than 100 years since the inauguration of this building, the OAS headquarters, our institution still brings together the peoples of the Americas to address our responsibilities as a partnership of nations. As we look to the future, our work must also focus on the construction of a positive agenda that continues to favorably impact millions of lives every day.
The COVID-19 pandemic brought unprecedented challenges to our member states and the people we serve. In response, the OAS Secretariat for Integral Development adopted a three-pronged approach by 1. Adjusting our portfolio of existing projects, 2. Exploring new projects to meet emerging needs, and 3. Expanding multi-sectoral partnerships. The results achieved in 2020 demonstrate the resilience of our member states and the commitment of the OAS SETI to work with member states and partners towards our common goals in the development of our region. Our Network on Competitiveness launched the COVID-19 Ideas Accelerator, sharing 250 tools, health solutions, responses, and recovery plans. The Network for Labor Administration published a portfolio of responses from ministries of labor to COVID-19, sharing over 420 measures taken to protect workers, employment, and income. Likewise, The Inter-American Teacher Education Network series, Teaching STEM in Quarantine, provided 117,000 teachers with key tools to continue advancing STEM education during the pandemic. Through its network and platforms, the Inter-American Committee on Ports promoted international and national best practices, guidelines, protocols, and recommendations on COVID-19 safety measures and continuity of logistic operations. Initiatives such as the Education in Times of Change platform allowed us to meet urgent needs by offering timely tools on virtual education and a dedicated space for ministries to share strategies, actions, and solutions. Other programs such as the Row Fund stepped up, providing emergency grants to offset the challenges imposed on our students by the pandemic. SETI's partnerships are adding value to member states in the form of technical assistance, training, and access to tools and services. In partnership with leading private sector institutions, we offered micro, small, and medium enterprises access to online tools and training, increasing their visibility and participation in e-commerce, a key to their survival and growth in the pandemic and post-pandemic era. A new OAS SETI Facebook initiative provided 85,000 MSMEs across the region with capacity building opportunities and WhatsApp business tools to aid response, recovery, and resilience building. The Caribbean Small Business Development Centers program achieved real impact, supporting new businesses, expanding sales, and driving growth. A new network of Caribbean SPDCs will broaden the program's reach. The Inter-American Committee on Tourism, the C2, convened ministerial-level policy dialogue in an urgent response to the impact of the pandemic on the hard-hit tourism and hospitality sectors. Policymakers and experts discussed biosanitary protocols, travel and visa facilitation, among other critical areas for the sector's recovery. Partnering with the George Washington University and the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, we went ahead with the scheduled first Indigenous Tourism Forum of the Americas, pivoting to a virtual format and convening over 240 participants from indigenous communities, the private sector, and governments. SETI also integrated sustainable development practices in the COVID-19 response. The pandemic is a daily reminder of the links between water, health, sanitation, food security, and nutrition. We ensured the continuity of our water management projects in the Plata Basin and worked with governments and partners in the design of an investment portfolio valued at $90 million. Additionally, the Energy and Climate Partnership of the Americas continued to share relevant best practices and responses to the pandemic on energy and air quality. These few examples indicate our collective impact. We cannot do this alone. It is now more urgent than ever to address the region's structural weaknesses, to recover from the health, economic, and social crises occasioned by the pandemic and prepare for future shocks. It is imperative that we work together as we risk losing recent development gains and seeing millions fall back into poverty. It is time for the region to redirect course and pursue a more sustainable, resilient, and equitable future for all. We are in this together.
But the resilience building agenda is too big for any one stakeholder to address acting alone, and simply bringing together stakeholders, whether at the national, subnational, regional, or global level, is not enough. Effective, focused, and sustained coordination among stakeholders is paramount to provide countries with integrated and comprehensive support.
The OAS, as a hemispheric forum and honest broker, must continue to facilitate this process while we work with member states towards the attainment of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Cooperation, collaboration, and partnerships that include all actors strengthen us, enabling us to be more than the sum of our parts. We can and we must work together. The future of our region depends on it.
Bueno, la CIM tiene una agenda enorme en el tema de democracia y de liderazgos. El primer ámbito tiene que ver con la gobernanza electoral, para que esta gobernanza electoral responda a las necesidades con las que fue creada, y es buscar los espacios de redistribución del poder. Después hay un programa interamericano sobre liderazgo de las mujeres, donde generamos conocimiento y también tenemos cursos de capacitación. Hay un poderoso curso que ha llegado a más de 1000 mujeres con más de 15 ediciones, que es para candidatas electorales, en las cuales conversamos con ellas, pero también nos ponemos en una agenda de solidaridad y articulación y alianzas entre las mujeres, a pesar de las múltiples diferencias ideológicas o de partidos políticos. También hablamos de los temas de violencia política, porque no es lo mismo llegar que quedarse, y la violencia política es una forma de ejercicio de disciplinar a las mujeres para que vuelvan al mundo de lo privado y enfrentar la violencia, hacer buenas investigaciones, buenas leyes que permitan sancionar la violencia política. Es parte de las aspiraciones de la CIM en este programa de liderazgo de las mujeres. La aspiración histórica de las mujeres es estar en el mundo de lo público, que nuestro trabajo sea remunerado y que tenga un reconocimiento. COVID ha puesto en evidencia una profundización de las brechas existentes para el logro de este objetivo. Estas brechas existentes ahora dan cuenta de que podríamos tener un rezago de más de 2 décadas en el mundo laboral, que el cierre de brechas que se previó que podía tardar 100 años en cerrarse, ahora se habla de 135 años para cerrar la brecha entre los hombres y las mujeres. Entonces, nuestro objetivo es que miren el derecho de las mujeres al empoderamiento económico, que el statement "quédate en casa", que es un viejo conocido del patriarcado, no sea que nos quedemos en casa siempre, y que entendamos que la inserción de la mitad de la población, de este talento humano que tiene una serie de ventajas competitivas, es necesario para el crecimiento económico. De manera que la CIM está colocando esta realidad, está colocando las necesidades de las mujeres y está haciendo unas recomendaciones de rutas para poder cumplir con el derecho al empoderamiento económico y con el crecimiento económico.
Okay, so morning once again. I'm going to say good morning to Ambassador Mora. When he comes in, y'all can tell him I said it. Distinguished guests, panelists, fellow commissioners, attendees, staff of the commission, and all those people who are online. I understand we have about 60 people who have registered, so I don't know where to say hello to them, but thank you for attending. My name is Roberta Clark, and I am the second vice chair of the commission, and I'm also the country rapporteur for the United States and the rapporteur for the rights of LGBTI persons, and it's my pleasure today to moderate our discussion. We are here, as you know, to explore the role of freedom of expression in addressing and ending structural discrimination, particularly focusing on issues related to race, sex, gender, sexual orientation in the United States. We are undertaking this event as part of the Commission's monitoring and promotional mandate. And as some of you may know, over the last 2 years, we've been closely following the issue of censorship in the United States, which threatens to roll back significant progress in this country made over the last decades. And in fact, we even issued a press release on censorship and education back in 2022. Pedro, I think it was back in 2022. So the Commission is really concerned about the banning of books in schools and in libraries, and we understand, based on analyses undertaken by the American Libraries Association, civil society organizations such as ACLU and PEN, who are here today, and the media, that most banned books speak to LGBTIQ persons and issues, the fight against racism, the fight for sexual and reproductive rights in education, as well as social activism. So there's a pattern in the books that are being banned from libraries and schools. Article 12 of the American Declaration on the Rights and Duties of, I want to say people, because we're going to change that, right? The formal title is Rights and Duties of Man. You know, that's one of these curiosities in English where they say in man includes woman, when it's actually constructively the other way. Because female includes male, women include men, you know, in the actual, the spelling. So it's very ironic, ideologically, that the script is so flipped. Yeah. So, but the Declaration provides that every person has the right to education, which should be based on principles of liberty, morality, and human solidarity. Within the inter-American jurisprudence, these are essential values for the preservation of pluralism and tolerance, and the basic pillars of democratic societies. A free society today and tomorrow is one that can engage in rigorous public debate about itself. We think that denial of freedom of expression can also be a dark alleyway to the disregard of other human rights. So let us think about how education opens up our understanding and our hearts to the histories and the realities of populations that have experienced historical and structural discrimination in law, policy, and in culture. When that light of understanding is dimmed or distorted, there's a real threat of increasing intolerance, as we've seen everywhere in the world, discrimination and even violence against those who are othered. When dissemination of information and perspectives on histories of violations are impeded, this also weakens the legitimacy of the demand for accountability, for reparative justice, and for guarantees of non-repetition. So it is for this reason that the Commission asserts that the preservation of freedom of expression is a necessary condition for the peaceful and free functioning of democratic societies in the Americas. You know, misinformation, when there's censorship, the space doesn't remain empty. That space is filled up with something else, and oftentimes it is with misinformation. And misinformation, as we know, especially in the world of social media, is not benign, but actively dangerous for democracies. It can polarize and prevent open dialogue and debates where we use reason and logic to convince rather than triggering emotions that are about intolerance and discrimination. So today we have an esteemed panel of experts who will be speaking to this topic and sharing their insights. But before we start the discussion and before I introduce the panel, I would like to invite the President of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, I have to call her Madam Margaret May Macaulay, with all our love and deference, to open our session. Margaret, over to you.
Thank you, Madam Roberta. Good morning, everyone. I hope you all had a good night after a good dinner and a good breakfast. So we're all ready to work. My very best wishes to all of you here present who are very important to the human rights advancement process, and to the distinguished speakers we have invited to speak, Secretariat officials, I see your faces and thank you for your good work. My colleagues, commissioners, thank you for your very good work as well. And all others who are present for this panel discussion. This event seeks to provide a platform for open and constructive dialogue on the issues of restrictions on freedom of expression of vulnerable groups, including the exercise of this right in educational institutions and all spheres like that. And discrimination on the grounds of ethno-racial backgrounds, genders, sexual orientations, and gender identities, especially here where we stand in the United States. As the rapporteur on the rights of persons of African descent and against racism. And for the elderly, my presentation focuses on the current situation of the critical race theory, known as CRT, in the field of education. Education, we all know, plays a relevant role in promoting the right to equality and non-discrimination. It is an intrinsic right which is indispensable for the realization of other rights. In the area of personal autonomy, education is the primary tool which adults, children, and adolescents can use to bridge the poverty gap and gain access to decision-making spaces. Education is a tool for transformation which enables cultural change within a society, which can then be free of discrimination. Anti-racist and decolonized education and culture are essential to combating prejudices which justify racial discrimination. In this regard, the United Nations, oh dear, that would be a miracle. The United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, CERD, recommends that states review the terminology of texts which contain stereotyped information on people of African descent and replace them with content on dignity and equality. It is thus essential for states to promote pedagogical strategies, both in the content of curricula and other educational resources, which prohibit the direct or indirect use of stigmatization based on individuals' ethnic or racial origins, be they indigenous, of African descent, or other marginalized ethno-racial backgrounds. In March, the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights called for the promotion of the historical memory of people of African descent and indigenous peoples through the implementation of specialized professorships, which will provide an account of the history of the African diaspora, as well as the contributions which indigenous people and people of African descent have made to states in the region, and acknowledging their emancipation processes in the Americas and the systematic discrimination and exclusion to which they have been exposed and are still experiencing. Kimberly Crenshaw, one of the founders of the theory, describes it as follows, and I quote, "Critical race theory is a practice. It's an approach to grappling with a history of white supremacy that rejects the belief that what's in the past is in the past, and that the laws and systems that grow from that past are detached from it." Close quotations. Efforts to ban critical race theory are widespread, as dozens of states have passed laws and more than 40 have proposed laws to that effect. Critics of critical race theory argue that the movement itself is discriminatory against non-racialized people. For example, in April, an authority issued a statement following the Texas Senate's banning of critical race theories in universities. I quote, "Last season, we banned critical race theory in kindergarten through 12th grade because no child should be taught that they are inferior to others due to their race, sex, or ethnicity." End of quote. In my view, these initiatives may erase historical memory and truth, which are the foundations of accountability, guarantees of non-repetition, and for reparations. I conclude. As a former Inter-American Court judge and the only Afro-descendant woman there, who has been there, I have seen how elements of critical race theory, such as intersectionality, which is a theory framework introduced by Kay Crenshaw, who I referred to earlier, are frequently used in categories of analysis in the court sentences, and not only in relation to Afro-descendant issues. So, my friends, within the universal mandate of eliminating racial discrimination in all spheres, critical race theory's contribution to defending human rights must be defended by us all. Thank you very much. And we start our work.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for your thoughtful words. And now I would like to invite Ms. Suzanne Goldberg to deliver the keynote speech. Until recently, quite recently, she held the position of Deputy Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education, and she's now currently a senior advisor and legal expert to the Special Envoy to advance the human rights of LGBTQI plus persons in the U.S. Department of State. We appreciate, Suzanne, your participation as a representative of the U.S. Department of State, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Clark. I'm really honored. Thank you. I'm honored and thrilled and feel a great privilege to be here today with all of you. Thank you to the IACHR. Thank you to President McCauley, Commissioner Clark, Special Rapporteur Vodka, for this kind invitation to participate today. I'm really thrilled to be here, both in my capacity currently, and I'll speak about that in a moment, with the U.S. State Department, with the Office of the Special Envoy to advance the human rights of LGBTQI plus persons, also as a person who has been with the U.S. Department of Education in our Office for Civil Rights since the beginning of the current administration, and also as a law professor, a teacher, college teacher, teacher of K-12 students, and importantly as a student. Because I think when we think about these issues of the relationship between freedom of expression, access to information, and our ability to engage critically with the world for all of us, we are all students. And the ability to receive information, debate, and contest ideas is a critical part of learning to participate and then participating in what is happening in the world today and also our future. I'm also thrilled to be here with Ambassador Mora and our colleagues from the U.S. mission to the OAS. I'll be talking about a couple of things, as I've been asked. First, to think about the ways in which restrictions on freedom of expression can affect vulnerable groups' participation in education and other parts of civil society, so picking up on the themes already discussed, and on the importance of protections for expression as a pathway to ending structural discrimination. In my current role in the State Department, our focus is, of course, on issues outside of the United States, but I've been asked to speak about issues in the United States, so we'll be drawing on some previous experience. But in doing that, I do want to underscore that many of the issues that I will be discussing, as all of you know, have their counterparts in important OAS, IACHR protections, and a range of protections, including in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whose anniversary, 75th anniversary, is just about upon us. And I won't have time to draw all of those connections today, but hopefully we will in the conversation. So I will take up today's questions in three parts. First, I want to offer you an example of what actually can happen in a school when a book ban is introduced, right? What that feels like to students when there is a restriction on access to information and readings about racism or LGBTQI plus persons, through a selective book ban or a ban on teaching certain topics. I'll focus mostly on books, leave to my colleagues to perhaps talk about other issues. Second, I want to provide a few examples from American history of the First Amendment's protection for minority voices. And third, I want to highlight some of the ways that government can act to ensure that all students have an equal opportunity to participate and learn in their schools, and why this matters for all of us, again, whether we are in school now or whether we graduated a very long time ago or somewhere in the middle. So I'll focus especially on these bans in elementary and secondary schools, right, in kindergarten through 12th grade in the United States, because that is, as you mentioned, President Macaulay, that is Madam President Macaulay, because that is where the action is happening legislatively in the United States. But of course, it's not the only place. What's happening in colleges and universities is important as well. And it is important also to keep in mind that bans in these lower grades create or affect the foundations for education in later grades and beyond, including for adult education for that matter. I should also note at the outset that when I talk about book bans, what I'm talking about are selective book bans. That is, bans that are intentionally brought, restrictions on access to or removal of books from school libraries that are imposed on specific types of books based on their topics or the identity of the author or the identity of those featured in the books. So this is different from what school leaders and teachers do all the time, which is select books that are intended to educate their students, that are for pedagogical goals, relying on their professional backgrounds. So turning to the first point, what can happen when a selective book ban is introduced in an elementary or secondary school? When it selectively restricts books about racism, for example, or LGBTQI+ persons. These aren't the only kinds, as I'm sure you'll hear from my colleagues. These are the ones I'll focus on through a civil rights lens. And I want to draw an example from an actual school board meeting, and these will be examples of what students said at one school board meeting when a selective book ban was being debated, and what they said about this book ban, and this particular one happened to encompass LGBTQI+ content. This was a ban that was being considered. It was ultimately modified when it was passed, but I think this will help you feel what it feels like. So for context, at that school board meeting, as with many of these meetings, lots of parents spoke. Some of the parents spoke about sexually explicit content that concerned them, and other parents spoke about removing books for reasons related to gender identity or sexual orientation or critical race theory, or they've added sort of remarks sort of rejecting ideas of inclusion and diversity. So what did the students say? The students' comments in particular focused on gender identity, sexual orientation, the race or color of authors or characters in the book, and on the impact of removing the books, what it felt like. One gay student, for example, said that the book ban immediately made the school environment more harsh for the students, and that people like him who are not closeted are watching their safe spaces disappear. Right? And keep in mind, these are students whose main activity at school, in addition to making friends and all of that, is about learning, right? They're watching their safe spaces disappear. How does that affect any of our ability to learn? So he added that he's sick of being fearful at school. And this book ban, or this proposed book ban, only made his learning environment worse. Another student who identified herself as Asian said it is hard for her to find books with main characters who are of her race. She added that she knows other students of other minority backgrounds who have the same struggle, and that banning books written with diversity silences mainly minority voices. Again, that's her expression of her experience of this proposed ban. A third student who characterized the district's book ban or proposed ban as singling out books by authors who are gay, supporters of the LGBTQI+ communities, and people of color, expressed the belief that the district did not care about diversity. So, okay, that's the conversation. When we step back and we consider this environment, or these comments and others like them, I think we can flag 3 concerns. I mean, really a lot, but I'll focus on 3, given our time. About process, about message, and about impact. So on first is a process concern. The very act of a school board singling out books to be banned can create confusion, concern, and even fear for students, even if those leading the efforts are not intending to achieve that result. Right? This is because it's unusual, at least in the American school system, the US school system, for the school board or the government to tell librarians what books they can stock on their shelves, or to tell teachers what books they can teach or even talk about. And in libraries, of course, access to the books is voluntary, right? Students seek out books to learn more. So one is a process concern, confusion, fear. Even if the book ban is narrow, it often gets discussed in a much broader context that can create a chilling effect. Second is a message concern, right? The act of government stepping in and removing books selectively can send a message to students that they are not trusted to pick books out of a library at their school that are of interest to them, in an age-appropriate fashion, of course, because that is the job of the library and the education professionals at a school, or to understand and critically evaluate what they read, including when what they read is about people who share aspects of their identity, of who they are. Because the books subject to these selective removals are overwhelmingly about people of color or by people of color or LGBTQI+ persons, the message then, not surprisingly, most often is understood to affect the students with those identities or students whose families and friends have those identities. So if one is a process concern, one is a message concern, the third is an impact concern, right? What happens when students feel targeted in this way? And I referred to this a little bit earlier when I was talking about the students' comments. So here's more of what I've heard from over time, right? That students are reluctant to go to the library after these book bans. That they are, for some students, that was the most welcoming place they had at the school, right? Students participate less in class. I'm not saying all students, this is the impact on some that students have reported. They participate not at all. They stop going to class. They face increased bullying at school. Like the student said, he was afraid in the environment, it had gotten worse. And one of the possible reasons for that bullying is other students feeling empowered by the selection and the targeting of certain books related to certain identities, that creates an environment in the school. So the bottom line, whether intentionally or not, is that a book ban, a selective book ban, can further barriers to participation in education and barriers to learning. Participation in conversation, even access to education. Okay, so very quickly on the second point, First Amendment's protection of minority voices. American civil rights history is full of examples where the First Amendment protection from government interference with freedom of expression has been the source of protection for unpopular groups. Right, in public elementary and secondary schools, this has protected anti-war protests or students wanting to speak out in anti-war protests in favor of or against racial justice, reproductive health access, LGBTQI+ rights, and more. At the college level in the 1980s, there was a spate of public universities as there were small gay organizations, student organizations, trying to get organized, and there were some public colleges that were saying, no, we're not going to recognize your student organization. And at that time, when most gay rights lawsuits were losing, those suits won because the courts understood that the First Amendment said you can't selectively allow these student groups to organize, but not those because you don't like their message or what they stand for. Outside the education context, we have many examples around racial justice, around disability rights, around just about sort of any issue that a social justice organization has engaged with. And again, I'm sure my colleagues will speak to this more. Of course, the First Amendment's protection of freedom of expression protects the expression of all sorts of unpopular ideas and sometimes popular ideas, right? Protects expression in favor of book bans, in favor of racial disparities, in favor of gender disparities, right? And so we understand that that kind of expression can also shape an environment in which students are learning and so forth. And there are important questions and conversations to be had about how to respect freedom of expression and also create, and the contestation of ideas, which is critical to education and learning, and also create an environment in which all students feel welcome to learn and pursue their interests. The key point underlying the First Amendment for our purposes right now is that in government-run schools, the government cannot pick and choose books for students to have access to based on the content. And so even in public schools, where schools have a lot of latitude to restrict expression in certain ways, and it's quite appropriate to the educational mission. However, the selective book bans reinforce the point that that schools and public schools and the government cannot single out and pull away books from students based on the content alone, right? We don't like the idea, or we don't like the representation alone. Okay, so it's not only the First Amendment that provides protection, and very quickly, I will just say, get to the third point. What else can government do? So for more than 50 years, the United States has had in place an important series of laws that protect civil rights in the education context. And I won't dive into the details, we'll just say they prohibit discrimination in education based on race, color, national origin, sex, which we have interpreted to cover sexual orientation and gender identity, and sex characteristics in some settings, and disability, among other things. And so there's a lot to be said about these laws. Happy to talk about them offline, and really you can find a lot of information on the US Department of Education's website, the Office for Civil Rights. But what's important to know here is that these laws cover public elementary and secondary schools. They also cover any college or university or other post-secondary institution that receives federal funds. And in the US context, virtually every college and university receives federal funds because they take student financial aid. So these laws cover the education landscape by and large. And so this means that schools have a legal responsibility, in addition to an educational responsibility, to provide all schools with equal opportunity, all students, with equal opportunity to access their education and remove discriminatory barriers to access. Right? Some of those barriers are physical. If you don't have a ramp into a school, somebody who moves through the school with a wheelchair is not going to be able to get in, right? And some of those are policy barriers, right? If there is a selective book ban that targets certain groups or certain individuals, or some other policy, it may have a blocking effect. Not a physical blocking effect, but nonetheless a blocking effect on equal access and opportunity. So if a school selectively does remove books, the school has an obligation to consider whether that ban has created certain barriers to equal opportunity, and then it must address them. Now, it's not to say that every single selective book ban is going to create a legal, sort of legally recognized form of discrimination, but the point is that educational environments that are publicly funded do have an obligation to be aware, to see as a red flag policies and actions that may disrupt the educational environment for students in ways that create structural barriers or functional or experiential barriers to equal access to education. So stepping back, just briefly, we know, why do people go into education? I mean, I can say, well, I love to teach, but because we care, right? People go into education because they care typically about creating a welcoming environment in which all students have the opportunity to learn. And so when there are these barriers, whether physical or policy or environmental or otherwise, those restrict opportunities, because education is foundational to our future. We know that, and we have a legal obligation, and I think an educational ethical obligation to address those barriers. And one quick last point, these educational barriers affect not only the students who feel directly affected, right? They affect the environment. They send a message to everybody about who is valued, who is not, what ideas are valued and what are not. But without a broader, thoughtful context, they can result in really quite harmful restrictions. So as I close, I want to underscore that this difficult point has an important and powerful counterpoint, which is that efforts like are made here in holding this panel and fostering these discussions in the work that happens here and in educational environments around the world. Right, efforts to support equal opportunity and a non-discriminatory educational environment for all participants, whether students, teachers, staff, families that interact with the school, or in the marketplace, workplace, other areas, provide crucial protections on two levels. On an individual and a group level, they enable each of us to contribute, right, to share whatever our talents, and we want all of our students to share their talents with us now and into the future. And at a societal level, effective responses to discriminatory barrier make clear to individuals and to communities at large that all persons are valued and that none, perhaps especially those who are most vulnerable, should be subjected to discrimination and violence because of who they are. So I appreciate your creating the opportunity for this very important conversation, and thank you for including us as part of it.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. I think in your presentation you draw attention to the fact that this question of censorship and book banning, it's not an abstract or kind of theoretical question, but they're immediate negative consequences for real people. And then there are also longer-term impacts, which is sort of legitimizing a culture of stigmatization or bias, prejudice, and discrimination. But the immediate harm, I think, thank you very much for bringing that to our attention with the voices of students that you spoke to. The impact on the chilling, I'll use your word, the chilling impact, silencing, exposing them to bullying. You can just imagine that environment, right, where their lives they're being told that their lives do not matter. So thank you very much for giving that. I would like to hear later on, given the First Amendment protections, what is happening to all of these kind of state laws, right? What's going on there, and what are legal implications and legal actions that are being taken around that? But maybe some of the other panelists will talk about that. So now, I would like to invite Suzanne and Margaret to take their seats and ask our panel to join us. And our panel, Mr. Pedro Vaca, who is the Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression within the Commission. He's a Colombian lawyer. We also invite Ms. Casey Meehan, she is the Freedom to Read Program Director at PEN America. Her research centers students, educators, and school leaders' experiences in identifying strategies for reform and capturing emerging best practices. Well, I think we're really looking forward to the best practices. I'm Casey, and finally, Mr. Jamil Dakwar, who is the director of the American Civil Liberties Union Human Rights Program. Jamil serves as the ACLU's main representative of the UN and leads ACLU's international advocacy before other regional and international bodies, including the Commission. So with that, you all will stay at your seats, so you can come here. It depends on what you want, if to project or to be comfortable. It's up to you all entirely. I would like to start with Pedro, who can open our discussion today with an overview from his specialized office.
Thank you, Madam Commissioner Clark. It's a pleasure for me to be here with all of you. Commissioners, thanks for being part of this. And also, I would like to thank the staff of the Commission that has worked a lot to make this possible. Good morning, distinguished guests and esteemed colleagues. I am honored to speak today as a Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression, and we gather here to address a pressing issue in our society, the role of freedom of expression in dismantling structural discrimination, and this is a phenomenon deeply rooted and widely perpetuated in our societies. In recent years, we have witnessed an alarming rise in restrictions to the free flow of ideas across the United States, notably within the education system, as has said before. The trend of banning books, particularly those exploring LGBTQI+ issues and racial injustices, poses a significant threat to the right to freedom of expression. This trend not only contravenes the fundamental principle of democracy and human rights, but also has the potential to perpetuate the cycle of structural discrimination against marginalized communities. Last year, the American Library Association of the US reported an unprecedented wave of restrictions with over 1,269 demands to censor books and educational materials in 2022 alone. A 38% increase from the previous year and the highest number in more than 2 decades. These actions predominantly target literature discussing LGBTI+ narratives and racial minorities. Such practices echo historical patterns of oppression and seek to erase the diverse and essential stories of these communities from the public discourse. Education plays a crucial role in shaping societal perspectives and fostering a culture of inclusivity and understanding. However, recent legislative measures, such as the Don't Say Gay law in Florida, and similar laws in other states have severely restricted the breadth and diversity of content allowed in schools. Our office has been receiving reports that consider that these educational gag orders and intimidation bills have created a climate of fear among educators and students, stifling critical discussions on race, gender, and sexuality. We must acknowledge and recognize that this debate is taking place within conflicting frames, including legal ones. For instance, some form arguments based on the legal rights of guardians to ensure the religious and moral education of their children in conformity with their own convictions. Others try to justify some restrictions on the exercise of freedom of expression based on the protection of children against speech and discourses that they claim would not be appropriate for children their age. But, and I would like to highlight this question, but could those claims justify restricting certain histories, perspectives, and information when these stories, perspectives, and information can be part of the core identity of some marginalized and oppressed groups? I do not believe that in this event we can resolve these tensions that we face in US society today and along the hemisphere, but I do believe that this is an opportunity to make a strong case for the defense of freedom of expression. There has been a strong response from civil society and the judicial system objecting to those policies and, to some extent, their justification. Lawsuits challenging these restrictive measures, public demonstrations, and an organized National Day of Action in May in 2023 to protest the bans of legitimate content reflect the resilience and the determination of those fighting against censorship. These efforts can underscore the urgent need to protect the right to freedom of expression, especially for vulnerable groups. A consideration from our office is that freedom of expression is not only a fundamental right in itself, but it's also a cornerstone for the exercise of all other rights, including the right to education, access to culture, freedom of religion and belief, and freedom of peaceful assembly and association, among others. The lack of freedom of expression is a cause that contributes to the disregard of other human rights, and therefore the preservation of a freedom of expression is a necessary condition for the peaceful and free functioning of democratic societies in the Americas. When discussing marginalized communities, this freedom takes on an added layer of significance. Historically, these groups have been silenced or sidelined, making their voices imperative in our ongoing battle against structural discrimination. The Commission and our Office for Freedom of Expression have expressed their concerns over these measures that restrict the freedom of expression of marginalized groups, especially in the education system. Last year, as was said before, our office released a press release in concern over the reports of literary censorship in the United States, particularly in the education spaces. The majority of these target books relate to LGBTQI+ issues, also the fight against racism, rights to sexual and reproductive health, and social activism perspectives. According to public information, this trend affected the access to information for nearly 4 million students across the US and approximately 13,000 schools, districts in 32 states. The Commission and our office have stressed that the states must generate the conditions for there to be a true public deliberation on matters that concern all citizens, contemplating the breadth and plurality of voices, to process the tensions between rights and public controversies in an open and peaceful fashion and respectful of human rights. A public deliberation that considers the diversity of the society. And also in the words of the own Commission, a full and free discussion prevents a society from paralyzing and prepares it for the tensions and frictions that destroyed civilizations. A free society today and tomorrow is one that can openly engage in rigorous public debates about itself, and ourselves includes diversity, identity, and gender perspective. The measures aimed at banning books in schools instead of giving rise to a broad and robust debate on relevant issues has the impact of limiting the possibilities of democratic deliberation and a social understanding between us. In this regard, the duty of the states to guarantee the right to freedom of expression also implies contributing to a democratic citizenry in which, and I am quoting the Commission, is willing to discuss with others the reasons that enable it to support a theory or make a decision. And that also requires free flow of ideas. Education is a way to share messages that eradicate prejudices and build more inclusive and tolerant societies. Educational environments play a vital role in shaping individuals into responsible citizens and equipping young people for the active participation in society. We acknowledge that there is the possibility for parents to make choices regarding the education of their children. This is not without recognizing as well that limiting the discussion of topics of public relevance in these spaces undermines the potential of education to foster understanding, solidarity, respect, and responsibility. Moreover, education is a powerful tool to eradicate prejudices and build more inclusive, tolerant societies. It is imperative to preserve the distinctive expressions of historically discriminated and excluded groups, thereby promoting historical memory and contributing to societal tolerance and respect. As we engage in today's discussions, it is important to acknowledge that perceived tension surrounding this matter in the US. Resolving this tension hinges on safeguarding both freedom of expression and a robust civic space. Amidst various arguments on either side, it is essential to recognize that defending freedom of expression is a right that empowers marginalized communities and can be a tool against persistent structures of discrimination. This is a pivotal starting point, and also the voices of the marginalized groups are guiding lights for a more equitable future. And if I may, Commissioner Clark, we are in the week of the 25th anniversary of two human rights declarations. We were having a permanent council at the OAS a couple of days ago. One of the things that I highlighted there is that the American Declaration of the Duties and Rights of Men that also shows who wrote that, or the people invited to write it. was signed in my home country, in Colombia, and also was signed in a specific moment in which my city, Bogotá, was in flames, in a historical moment that is known as El Bogotazo. And I think human rights conversations should be not only a multilateral conversation that talks in a general way about what is happening in the region, but also we have to take care of the vicinity. And the Commission is in Washington, D.C., and I think we have to take care and to look at what is happening in front of our building. Thanks, Commissioner, for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Pedro, for your presentation. As you were talking about the books being banned, I went on the American Libraries Association. I was talking about that with Casey, and I saw one of the books banned is The Bluest Eye, written by the Nobel Prize winner Toni Morrison. I mean, how could you ban a book by her, writing about the intersectionality of race and racism and sexism? But there it is. Casey is with Penn, and she will be speaking to the trends in censorship, and I would like to ask her, I think she would like to go to the, I think it's better that way as well. And thank you very much, Casey, for agreeing to be with us today.
Okay. Hello, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here this morning. My name is Casey Meehan, as shared, and I serve as the director for the Freedom to Read program at PEN America. PEN America stands at the intersection of literature and human rights in protecting free expression in the United States and worldwide. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization with an unwavering commitment to free speech, a principle that we view as an underpinning of democracy. Over the last few years across the United States, we are witnessing alarming attacks on free expression, particularly the freedom to read, learn, and think. These pervasive efforts to suppress free expression are issued from state legislatures and advocacy groups and are targeting public schools, public libraries, and higher education institutions. Institutions that we also view as foundational to our democracy. These threats to free expression are affecting students, educators, faculty members, and librarians nationwide. Further, this campaign to suppress relies on authoritarian tactics of fear, intimidation, and silencing, straining and fostering mistrust in our public institutions to meet their goals of educating students with knowledge and critical thinking and facilitating the ongoing unification that undergirds a pluralistic society. Our daily news cycle highlights the roles of these individuals, organized groups, and legislatures in driving this campaign against public education, calling to ban books like This Is Your Time, a letter about the struggle for racial equality by Ruby Bridges, or the graphic adaptation of Anne Frank's diary, or Stella Brings the Family, a picture book about a girl, her two dads, and the meaning of family, as well as calls to restrict curricula, prohibit DEI initiatives, and cancel plays, field trips, and films. Since 2021, PEN America has been at the forefront of documenting 3 key trends in restricting the exercise of free expression in education, which we have termed educational gag orders, educational intimidation bills, and book bans. Each serves as bellwethers to the insidious efforts of groups of activists and politicians that aim to exert ideological control over education, unprecedented in its scope, scale, and size. In September 2020, former President Trump set the tone for such an assault, alleging that critical race theory, the 1619 Project, and the crusade against American history is toxic propaganda, ideological poison that, if not removed, will dissolve the civic bonds that tie us together. In January 2021, the nation's very first state-level educational gag order was introduced in Mississippi, proposing to strip state funding from any school where the New York Times 1619 Project was taught. Since then, PEN America has tracked the introduction of 307 educational gag order bills by 45 U.S. state legislatures. Such bills limit instruction on race, gender, and U.S. history in public schools and public colleges and universities. Initially, these bills focused on so-called critical race theory and divisive concepts. However, this past legislative cycle saw an explosion of educational gag orders restricting instruction on sexual orientation and gender identity. PEN America has also tracked the introduction of 392 education intimidation bills, introduced during the same period. These bills do not lead to direct censorship, like educational gag orders, but rather cast a chilling effect that creates the conditions for censorship indirectly. These bills aim to chill instruction and student self-expression through added pressures and expanded avenues for parents, government officials, and citizens to intervene in curricula and extracurricular decisions in public K-12 schools. To date, 40 educational gag orders and 39 education intimidation bills are now law or policy in 22 states, affecting millions of educators and students across public K-12 schools, colleges, and universities. These legislative efforts work in tandem with locally coordinated campaigns by groups of activists, many of which are intent on banning books in public schools and public libraries. Between July 2021 and June 2023, we recorded nearly 6,000 instances of book bans across 41 states and 247 public school districts. These bans have affected nearly 3,000 unique book titles and the professional works of over 2,500 creatives. And this is likely an undercount. Book bans can have a particularly pernicious effect on individuals from historically marginalized communities and identities. Authors whose books are targeted are most frequently female, people of color, and LGBTQ+ individuals. Banned books overwhelmingly depict stories by and about people of color and LGBTQ+ individuals, or include content related to sex and sexuality. Further, the rhetoric being marshaled to justify banning books containing historically marginalized identities regularly evokes long-standing stereotypes that stigmatize and dehumanize LGBTQ+ people and Black, Indigenous, and people of color as inherently sexual, obscene, pornographic, or inappropriate. Education experts, educators, and librarians, and free expression advocates are also acutely aware of how pressure from state laws, groups of activists, school boards, and district administrators on what is and is not permissible instruction or content is leading to heightened self-censorship. Book purchases are suspended or highly scrutinized, author visits are canceled, content restrictions are imposed, lesson plans are watered down, classroom discourse is tempered and sometimes outright silenced. School librarians and educators from Florida to Missouri are directed to err on the side of caution when it comes to stocking books in their libraries. But as they have done so, they have limited access and freedom, and students' freedom to engage with diverse perspectives, viewpoints, histories, stories, and identities. Books are mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, a phrase introduced by Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, a phrase that is often evoked among those fighting against book bans as a reminder that books are critical representation of one's own lived experiences. They offer gateways for learning and understanding other people's unique lived experiences, and they help deepen empathy across those differences, across those unique lived experiences, in helping us all navigate life in a diverse and pluralistic democracy. Books and instruction that include, highlight, and represent LGBTQ+ identities or feature prominent characters of color are historically underrepresented in our public schools. Efforts to develop more culturally responsive curricula and ensure better representation in learning and reading materials have grown over the last several years, only to be met with alarm and opposition by a small group with outsized influence. Books are powerful to children and adults alike. Authentic and varied representation, particularly for historically excluded communities, is critical in our schools. We can learn from our history. Episodic attacks on the freedom to read and learn with the aim of suppressing marginalized or vulnerable communities are not new. We have been here before. This coordinated campaign to remove books and essential representations of our pluralistic society from across our schools is inherently undemocratic. And while the use of social media and the influx of news outlets makes this current effort feel especially heightened, our way out must be informed by past movements that center efforts to build inclusive and equal societies. As shared by Ashley Hope Perez, author of Out of Darkness, one of the most frequently banned books over the last almost 3 years, the thing we need to do is be very, very vocal. PEN America, alongside many national and local advocacy organizations, student groups, parent groups, teacher and librarian associations, authors and publishers, has mounted a counter effort to defend the rights of students and the freedom to read. Our response relies on 3 key strategies: increase public awareness to activate public will, support legislation that upholds principles of free expression, and challenge any legislation, policy, or practice that diminishes the freedom to read, learn, and write. Our approach is informed by innumerable and invaluable conversations with librarians, educators, students, school administrators, parents, grandparents, authors, and publishers alike, listening to their experiences and efforts navigating and pushing back against this censorial movement. Since 2021, PEN America has published several critical reports highlighting the growing trends of book bans and educational gag orders. We have issued hundreds of statements and explainers calling out threats to free expression in education. We have partnered with state and federal lawmakers to develop and propose legislation upholding the freedom to read. Just this week, PEN America supported Representatives Frost, Raskin, and Wilson's introduction of the Fight Book Bans Act, a piece of federal legislation aimed at alleviating some of the financial burden falling on districts as they navigate thorough and often costly book challenges and review processes. Further, we, alongside Penguin Random House and authors Ashley Hope Perez, Sarah Brennan, David Levithan, George M. Johnson, and Kyle Lukoff, as well as several parents, filed suit against a school district in Florida for its unconstitutional book bans and disproportionate effect on authors of color and LGBTQ+ authors and narratives. And today, here, my call to action to all of us in this room is to use your voice and our collective voice in defending the freedom to read, learn, and teach by speaking to elected officials, by supporting organizations defending free expression and education like PEN America, the National Coalition Against Censorship, the American Library Association, or local groups like the Florida Freedom to Read Project or students engaged in advancing Texas. At PEN America, we recognize the power of the word to transform the world. Students are powerful, and historically attempts to silence those stories have been rooted in fear. This year, PEN America's annual Freedom to Write lecture was delivered by Ta-Nehisi Coates, who stated, "The enemies of equality, the enemies of freedom, have always recognized that the first thing you attack when you want to strip people of their rights is the imagination, the ability to imagine those rights in the first place. And books are excellent, exceptional, maybe our best technology for conveying that. And that's what's at stake when the freedom to read, the freedom to write, and the freedom to learn are in jeopardy, and that's why we stand up for them." Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Casey. We really hear your call to action. Use our collective voice to defend the right, the freedom to learn, read, and teach. I very much like that. And if we have time, I would like to ask you, did you see this coming? This censorial movement, as you referred to it, did you see that coming? Or what are the factors? That may be a seminar for another day, but it has had some spectacular success, hasn't it?
It has.
Yes, anyways. So our third panelist, Jamil Dakwar, can you want to stay there or you want to go? I'll go there. Yes, good, good. Thank you much. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I appreciate having this discussion here, particularly focusing on the United States. I think it's one of those things that the Inter-American Commission can make much more impact when we really focus on specific issues and situations. While important to continue to promote and set norms and standards more generally, but I think really what would make a difference is when the Commission is engaging and bringing different voices to speak about particular situations that have, particularly those that have risen to very alarming levels. So I will, in very 10 minutes, it's hard to really cover a lot and say much, but I appreciated my colleagues who covered a lot of the things that gave me a chance to elaborate a little more. I would like to start from where they actually ended, particularly with regard to the censorship in the classroom and the inhibiting or limiting education rights, particularly for marginalized communities, or particularly this terrifying notion or terrifying movement of re-whitewashing, what we're seeing, re-whitewashing our history. And in a way, speak to you a little bit about what does that mean, and also maybe use more of my time to focus on the higher education system, where I think there's a lot of alarming also crackdown on free speech. I want to start by saying, first, I agree with pretty much everything that was said, but just to highlight a few things about the alarming number of those, what we call them, essentially laws or different measures that were taken to limit the ability to discuss or the instruction about racism and sexism and other parts, or whether it's in the context of U.S. history in general. One thing to say is that 45 states have introduced bills to limit instructions about racism and sexism. 45 states. 17 states passed what essentially is education gag orders, right? In addition to that, 700 efforts have been made to exclude critical race theories. And that reaches about 40% of classrooms in basically censorship targeting higher education. So 40% of those measures targeted higher education. These are really alarming figures. This movement is a vocal, discriminatory minority movement that is pushing these education gag, essentially gag orders or gag education on limiting, restricting the ability to study and engage in instructions and in education setting that brings this history of the United States. It is also important to highlight that it's not only about critical race theory. A lot of the efforts have been targeting other race-conscious instructions, right? And by the way, critical race theory is not taught at the levels of elementary school or, this is a really manufactured representation of how the CRT, and I will talk about the reasons for that. So this revisionist efforts by the so-called patriotic, very vocal minority, discriminatory minority, is really trying to silence the ability of groups, marginalized groups in particular, to be able to talk about the salience of not only the history of racism, structural racism, institutional racism, sexism, homophobia, but to link it to nowadays reality. And in that regard, I think it was really important to look at why is this happening. I think one reason that we saw, and the ACLU has been fighting these laws and restrictions in a number of states, including in Florida, by challenging the Anti-Woke Act, as well as the law in Oklahoma. But what we saw over the years, the reasons for these initiatives and measures that were pushed have a number of reasons. One is the political environment where there has been a lot of organizing around battling and eliminating structural racism and systemic racism, particularly after the summer of 2020. But it really started with the foundation of the Black Lives Matter movement after Trayvon Martin's killing in Florida, in the state of Florida. This commission has looked into these issues. In fact, the commission visited Florida and other states, and under the leadership of Commissioner and President McCauley, have produced one of the most important reports on structural racism, discrimination against African American and Black people, particularly looking at all aspects of discrimination in the context of the criminal legal system. But one aspect that it has highlighted was the questions of systemic structural racism, but also reparations. And the movement for reparations has been gaining steam, particularly after the 2020 racial justice protests. Not only that, what we've seen in 2017, there's a demographic shift. For the first time in the history of the United States, white students are a minority of the students in the overall nationally. So, and there's economic disparities that have made the conversation about the racial wealth gap and the linkages between the history of the United States of slavery, Jim Crow, structural racism, come up to the surface, and tackling it as a way to address present-day continuing systemic racism. This is really what we're seeing now is a kind of a backlash to racial and gender awakening. And if you add to that, the trans rights movement is part of that movement too, right? The idea that people are pointing to the need for reckoning with our history, with why we do have structural racism in the United States, and that this backlash is being manifested in these censorship laws, restrictions across the United States, and we have to keep that in mind. And there was some sort of a thinking that we are in a post-racial society. After particularly the election of President Barack Obama, there was like, okay, we're done with issue of racial discrimination in the United States. So therefore, we really need to keep that in mind. But it is also important to think about free speech, not just in the education system, has different manifestation. In the United States, as many countries as well, free speech is also about protest rights, it's about assembly rights, it's about association rights. And in our country, First Amendment is a cornerstone of our democracy. And yes, the United States stands out in sets a different standards when it comes to protection of free speech, which often protects also hate speech. That in of itself did not prevent the racial justice movement to use the First Amendment for rejecting the ideas of white supremacy, rejecting racial segregation, using the affirmative measures in order to push for protections for marginalized communities. And we've seen that advances in the civil rights era using First Amendment protections in order to advance equality. So there's an intrinsic relationship between liberty and equality. And there are people who think that could be tension there. Often there could be tensions sometimes level to the point where people would feel like should be taking sides. I have to side with either First Amendment free speech or I have to side with equality. In our experience, it's important to reconcile both, and there's a way to have them both coexist because they are so important to our democracy, particularly for marginalized communities. Despite the fact, and we have to keep that in mind, that most people who are belonging to minority communities in the United States are the ones who also feel the brunt of hate speech and attacks on using First Amendment rights in order to legitimize attacks on minority groups, right? But that doesn't mean that we need to reject the idea and to give the government the power to decide which views and which books would be singled out. And that's what really is so important about the approach to First Amendment in terms of the so-called neutral doctrine, is that we really can't let the government have so much power to decide over these things, because then ultimately, again, in our experience, marginalized communities will be the first to be paying a heavy price. And we've seen that over and over again. When we give the government more power in those kind of situations, it doesn't help protect historically marginalized groups. I wanted to end by saying a few things about the higher education, because we are in a very difficult time. And I want to speak specifically about the ability to organize in the context of university setting and college campuses. We've seen a serious attacks on the right to free speech, in the name of protecting students from intimidation, from discrimination, and sometimes there is a very, very difficult task. On one hand, universities, particularly public universities, as well as private, but in a different context and different legal standard. But under the First Amendment, private universities, public universities have to protect free speech, and as you heard from Suzanne, and eliminate, at the same time, all barriers to access to education, and making sure that the students themselves are not being discriminated against and not feeling in a direct, intimidating threats that is directed against them. There could be no tolerance of violence, and that's something that is clear. I hope so. That would not be protected. But what we've seen is that there are efforts to redefine what is protected speech and what is not protected speech. What is legitimate issues that could be debated, taught, discussed, protested on college campuses. And that in of itself is really alarming, because if we set who is to decide what is protected speech, and particularly when it comes to political speech, important to set those rules very clearly. We've seen efforts right now to use the very alarming, very horrifying incidents and events of anti-Semitic incidents and hate against Jewish students and Jewish communities to try to stifle free speech, to try to prevent students and other people who are organizing on very important political subjects. Even though this is an issue that is not happening here in the US backyard, it has very much relevance to the communities, many different communities. And so it's so important that while we do that, we do not allow attacks on free speech, as we've seen in some universities, and the University of Florida, in the context of Florida, again, state that went ahead to use anti-terrorism laws in order to suspend 2 student chapters of Students for Justice in Palestine. And that is going to be subject to now to legal challenge by the ACLU and Palestine Legal. We've seen attempt to redefine what is anti-Semitism to include criticism of Israel or Zionism, and to exclude that sort of speech and organizing on college campuses. Again, in our view, this is a political speech that should be protected, even if though it is uncomfortable for some people. That is exactly what the higher education setting is about. People go to schools not necessarily to be learning only about the things that they want to hear, but they should be able to hear sometimes very, very difficult and disturbing things. Of course, there are limits to where, when it comes to threatening people, intimidation on the personal level, and when it comes to issues of violence and safety, physical safety, where the lines should be drawn, and there should be measures taken. And I think that is where it is really important for the Department of Education to stick to those standards that have been, I think, rightly so, not allowing those efforts to stifle speech in the name of protecting certain type of foreign policy or political ideology on campuses. Again, this is something that is very much impacting all of us, because if we allow a particular group of opinions, particularly minority, unpopular group of opinion, to be discriminated against and marginalized, it would affect other unpopular and minority opinions. So I would want to stop here because I know that I ran out of time probably, and want to thank you for being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You know, the word that comes to me listening to all of this is pernicious, because in a sense, the agenda is not complete. The agenda of equality and non-discrimination is not complete But here we are using so much of our time, our resources, trying to hold ground or defend ground that has been hard fought for and hard won. So we're not anywhere near the finish line, but now we're stuck halfway because we have to defend that ground that has already been won. And that, to me, is the definition of pernicious here. Thank you very much for your presentation and your thoughts. I have some closing remarks to make, but I would like to ask our Commissioner, Julissa Mantilla, who is also the rapporteur for Memory, Truth, and Justice, and I think she really is the person who can give us some closing remarks, because a lot of this is about actually squashing memory and distorting truth. Thank you very much, Julissa. And denying justice.
Thank you very much. Freedom of expression includes speaking your own language, so it should be Spanish, but I like to do that in English as well. If you speak in Spanish, you say good morning to todos, todas, y todes. In English, it's good morning to everybody, but it's okay. First of all, these are only closing remarks, and it's not going to be that much. But first of all, I have to start saying thank you. Of course, to Yamir, Casey, Susan, for being here, and for all these ideas that they are not final thoughts, but a starting thought for more debate, for more interrogations. But also to the Commission as well. First of all, Commissioner Roberta Clark, Rapporteur for United States, because she has this idea for some months ago, and then Rapporteur Pedro Vaca. It was great, it was amazing, it was a new way of talking about freedom of expression. And even though this is for the states, I think that this could be interpreted and think about the whole region. And of course, the executive secretary here, all the team, Maria Claudia Pulido, Tander Renaud, Laura Morello, that is the soul of the Afro-descendant rapporteurship, and all the team. But you know, listen to you, all of you, I cannot forget, or I like to make a mention to this very famous case that I'm sure you know, the Handyside case against the United Kingdom, that is from 1976, when Richard Handyside, he bought the published rights of this book is in the UK, in Germany, and it's published in UK. And it has like 26 sections about sex. So it was forbidden in the UK, and this case go to the European Court. And it was a very famous case, not only because of this famous doctrine of margin of appreciation, but also because the sentence says, freedom of expression is applicable not only to the information or ideas that are favorably received or regarded as inoffensive or as a matter of indifference, but also to those that offend, shock, or disturb the state or any sector of the population. And this is freedom of expression. Freedom of expression that includes, for instance, colors, like the green color, that everybody knows what means. Freedom of expression that include the Me Too movement, el Ni Una Menos movimiento, and that includes as well, I'm not thinking about the danger now in our region in general, to forbid freedom of expression or to understand freedom of expression only to the right to talk. Because freedom of expression, as you mentioned, includes access to information, to all kinds of information. It includes as well information on sexual and reproductive rights, information about what's going on in the Caribbean, in the region, even though this event is about the United States. And when we were listening our president about the education and informant of education as a tool of transformation, I was thinking about what's going on education and what do we understand, what is education? Because people and leaders who are leading now our countries to the world, they belong to the privileged class with the best formal education. People who are being elected as president in the region, they are high-level educated, and they are denial, dictatorship, and gross human rights violation. So education and freedom of expression has to be linked with democracies, of course. And when we're talking about education, freedom of expression in our region, in Latin America, we have to mention, and we have to think about it, the right to protest, the right to express. Education then is not only to have access of all the information, but also to think about other economical and social and cultural rights. Access to education includes going to school, but also include to have food every day, to have housing, to have water, to have all of these things that sometimes we think that is obvious, but really are not that obvious. High-level educated people are part of the Supreme Court in the United States. And we have, for instance, something so wonderful like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but also have these judges that deny the Roe versus Wade precedent. So education and freedom of expression has to be hand to hand. And also education that should reflect diversities, gender diversity, but also other language, Quechua, Aymara, native language. It has to include as well the reality in the state of migration, to have the different approaches to migration and to combat the stereotype that only criminals come to the States to take advantage of what's going on here. So, thank you again for being here. Thank you again for this incredible seminar. Thank you for all your ideas. And I'm sure that the Inter-American Commission values your participation, and we will have more opportunities to share together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julissa. So I think we will agree that words do transform, as your feature speaker, Ta-Nehisi Coates, said at your event. Words as expressions of intention, words as an expression of planning, words that express and explain actions, words that frame actions, words that sort of capture our vision for the world that we want to be in. And when we suppress those words, and when we limit access to those words, we are limiting the imagination for freedom, and I very much like that formulation of it. We in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights are especially concerned about this in a country that has been so much associated with freedom of expression. I think you said that well earlier, Jamil. This is a country which has advocated freedom of expression, and we associate it with that kind of fundamental freedom. So when we see the rollbacks in that, it's something that, of course, is a big red flag for the Commission. And yet, this is happening at a certain scale. The numbers that you all spoke to us about, Suzanne and Casey and you, Jamil, the numbers, the sheer scale of this sensorial movement effort, I think is quite stunning, and the speed in which it has been happening. It is backlash in a sense, but it's also proactive, because it's also a planning for a certain kind of future that those who are promoting the censorship have in mind. And it's a future, it's like back to the future, you know, I think, or we're going backwards into the future. It's a back to the future vision that is anchoring all of this. So I think, I will not say, though, that we are doomed. I think that we have to be hopeful, but the hope has to be grounded in strategy and in action. The hope has to be grounded in determination and resolve. And amongst those organizations that are here, you have spoken about the actions that you all are taking. It's actions on litigation, testing legislation against the Constitution. That takes a lot of effort and it takes a lot of time. And it is using, as you asked us to do, Casey, the collective voice. And that collective voice can also be anchored in the Inter-American standards. So I want to say that the Commission will continue to monitor this very closely and to use the space that we have to also create space for civil society organizations and the state to engage with the Commission in dialogue so that we are implementing standards and we're responding in a way that's grounded in the standards, not only of your Constitution, but international human rights law. So with that, I want to thank everyone for their participation, starting with Suzanne Goldberg. Very much, we are going to be working so closely together as we continue next year through the Special Envoy's work. I want to thank Casey and Jamil. I want to thank Pedro, my co-conspirator, and his team in putting on this, we can call it a seminar. I would like to thank Margaret, of course, always, who is, as she would tell us, the longest serving person on the court and the commission. Yes. But we're saying that with pride and happiness, and who leaves the commission on the 31st of December at 11:59 p.m. All right, midnight. So we thank her for, and her team, Laura, for also being with us in the planning and execution of this, and of course, to our rapporteur on Memory, Truth, and Justice, Julissa Manti. And I just want to repeat something she said yesterday, and I will take it with me for the rest of my life, Julissa, when she said, principles don't have a price, but they do have a cost. And we have to be prepared to pay that cost as we stand on our principles. So thank you very much, everyone.